The room wasn't large, but it had the sort of hush that makes you instinctively lower your own voice. Wooden beams stretched overhead, and through the wide viewing glass, you could see the rolling green slopes of the Great Smoky Mountains rising like a painted backdrop. On this day, families had come not for the mountain views, but for a glimpse of something rarer, a small black bear cub that had recently been rescued after losing its mother. His name, at least in the papers filed by the sanctuary staff, was Juniper. Maya Carter, only 5 years old, was among the visitors. She didn't run ahead of the crowd or tug her mother's sleeve like other children did. She moved slowly, almost cautiously, her small hand gripping the fabric of her mother Lauren's cardigan. To anyone who hadn't been told, she might have seemed shy. Those who knew her story understood it differently. 2 weeks earlier, a man in a dark SUV had tried to lure her away with the promise of a puppy. Since then, Mia hadn't spoken a single word. At the front sanctuary, director Evan Brooks adjusted his microphone. This little cub was found near a roadside after his mother was struck by a car. He's safe here while we work toward releasing him back to the forest. His voice carried the warmth of a teacher who believed deeply in his work. The cub shuffled, lifted his nose, and pressed it against the glass. The crowd chuckled softly at the sight. Mia didn't laugh. She simply watched her green eyes fixed on Juniper with an intensity unusual for her age. The bear cub shifted his claws, clicking lightly against the floor, and for a moment it was as though the two of them were locked in some quiet exchange no one else could hear. Then, in the smallest of movements, Mia's fingers twitched a practiced, deliberate gesture that looked like nothing more than nervous fidgeting. Her mother noticed first. She felt the tug and glanced down, recognizing it. Weeks of therapy had introduced tiny signals Mia could use when words refused to come: a nod, a shake, or this little curl of her index finger. To Lauren, it was like hearing a whisper in a room otherwise silent. And then something happened that no one expected. Juniper froze. His small round ears perked. His body stiffened in a way that drew every eye. Slowly, with the caution of an animal piecing together a scent on the wind, he lifted his muzzle and fixed his gaze not on Mia, but on the back row of the viewing gallery. The cub didn't growl, didn't paw at the glass. He simply locked on his small body, trembling with alertness. The effect on the room was electric. Conversation died. Parents hushed their children. A collective awareness swept through the crowd that something was not right. Every face turned toward the line of sight the cub had chosen. There, standing near the exit, was a man in a gray jacket. Nothing remarkable about him at first glance. He looked like any other tourist. But as Juniper's stare bored into him, the man shifted uneasily. His jaw tightened. He slid one hand into his pocket as if weighing whether to stay or to leave. A heartbeat later, he turned toward the door. "Sir, please hold up," called out Ranger Troy Delgado, who had been stationed at the back in plain clothes. His tone was even, but his eyes were sharp. The man froze halfway to the exit and slowly withdrew his hand. A murmur ran through the visitors. Confusion mingled with fear. The silence stretched. The only sound was the muffled snuffling of Juniper against the glass nose, working furiously, as if he recognized something no one else could sense. For Mia, the moment landed differently. She clutched tighter at her mother's cardigan, but her eyes did not leave the man. This wasn't fear in its rawest form, it was recognition. Her tiny signal had not been random. She had seen him before. Lauren dropped to her knees, pulling her daughter close. "Honey, are you all right?" she whispered. Mia pressed her face into her mother's shoulder, but her small hand remained raised, finger curling once more in that same silent cue. Sanctuary staff moved quickly to keep the rest of the group calm. Evan Brooks switched off the microphone and quietly ushered visitors toward the side exit. A hush hung heavy, broken only by whispers. Why was the cub acting that way? Who was that man, Dr. Naomi Pierce? The wildlife rehabber overseeing Juniper's care knelt by the viewing glass. She knew the cub's behaviors well. Playful bounds, curious pawing, whining cries. This was different. This was recognition of something familiar and threatening. She couldn't yet name it, but she trusted the cub's instincts enough to know this was no coincidence. The ranger approached the man, asking for identification. Nothing dramatic unfolded in that moment, no sudden arrest, no raised voices. Just a quiet exchange and a note made to follow up. Still, everyone in the room had felt it the uncanny way a child's subtle signal and a black bear cub's reaction had converged freezing time. Later, over coffee in the small staff kitchen, Dr. Pierce explained to Lauren what she had seen. Black bears rely on scent more than almost anything. If Juniper reacted that strongly, it means he recognized something he'd smelled before. Maybe the man, maybe an object he carried. But combined with Mia's signal, she trailed off, shaking her head. Sometimes patterns line up in ways we can't ignore. What lingered for Lauren was not only the strangeness of the cub's behavior, but the way her daughter had participated. For weeks, Mia had seemed unreachable, locked in silence. Yet in that single twitch of her finger, she had spoken louder than words. Communication isn't always about volume. Sometimes it's about trust. The trust between a child and her caregivers. The trust between a frightened heart and an animal that still believes the world makes sense. Most parents never imagine they'll need to recognize such signals. We're used to words, to laughter, to the noise of daily life. But when those things fall away, what remains are the small gestures. Paying attention to them can be the difference between confusion and understanding. For the visitors that day, the sanctuary's usual message about conservation and wildlife took a back seat. They walked away talking not about habitat ranges or forest animals, but about the little girl who hadn't spoken, the cub who had stood still as stone, and the man who had left too quickly. In that moment, a new thread had been woven into Mia's story, one that connected her silence, a bear cub's instinct, and a question mark about a stranger in a gray jacket. From the outside, it might have looked like a scene from an animal video. A cute bear cub pressing against glass, a child clinging to her mother. But for those inside, it felt more like a page torn from a wildlife documentary mixed with a courtroom drama yet to unfold. Something primal had surfaced and no one could put it back. The crowd would remember the way they froze. The staff would remember the look in Juniper's eyes. And Lauren would remember the signal, the twitch of a finger that said more than her daughter's voice ever could at that moment. It was just the beginning. Because while the sanctuary staff calmed the guests and the ranger noted the man's license plate, investigators elsewhere were already piecing together fragments, a partial plate from a neighbor, a child's silence, an SUV that appeared in the wrong place at the wrong time. The sanctuary incident gave those fragments weight. It was as though Juniper himself had pointed his paw, saying, "Look closer." And so they would. What began as a quiet educational program about forest animals and the importance of protecting rare wildlife was about to ripple outward into something far larger. The next chapter doesn't unfold behind glass or under the beams of a sanctuary hall. It begins 2 weeks earlier, on a warm spring afternoon when Mia's world changed in the span of 4 minutes, the attempted lure that silenced her voice and the investigation that would soon circle back to the Smokies. On quiet streets just outside Gatlinburg, Tennessee, spring afternoons usually carry the simple soundtrack of children's voices and the steady hum of passing cars heading toward the mountains. It was here, 2 weeks before the sanctuary incident, that 5-year-old Mia Carter's world shifted in a way no one could have prepared for. Her mother, Lauren, had been folding laundry when she heard the front gate click. She glanced through the kitchen window, expecting to see her daughter twirling in the grass. Instead, she froze. A dark SUV had rolled to a stop near the curb. The driver's door stood ajar. A man crouched in the yard, smiling at Mia. His voice carried calm and practiced. "I've got puppies in my car. Want to see them?" Lauren dropped the laundry, bolted outside, and shouted her daughter's name. That single shout shattered the spell. The man straightened quickly, eyes sharpening, and reached for Mia's wrist. She yanked free just as a neighbor across the street, an older woman walking her terrier, called out in a firm voice, "Leave that child alone." The man froze only a second before slamming the door shut and gunning the engine. Tires screeched, leaving black marks on the asphalt. He was gone in seconds. What remained was silence, thick, heavy silence, broken only by Lauren's ragged breathing and Mia's heartbeat thudding against her chest as she clung to her mother's neck. From that moment forward, Mia didn't speak. Not that day, not the next, not the week that followed. Words, once a constant stream of chatter, vanished completely. It wasn't defiance. It was as if her voice had been locked away. Detectives arrived within minutes. The SUV description was vague, but a partial plate was caught by the neighbor K7R. The local patrol cars pushed out a bolo. Within a day, automatic license plate readers pinged on the sequence in multiple locations along the highway into the Smokies. What seemed at first like a random attempt was already connecting to a broader pattern of reports children approached, always near home, always with some friendly lure. Yet even as the case gained traction, Lauren's focus stayed on her daughter. Mia wouldn't answer simple questions, wouldn't respond even to her favorite bedtime story. When officers asked her gently to describe the man, she turned her face away. A psychologist soon gave the diagnosis selective mutism, not uncommon in children who've experienced trauma. It is an anxiety-based condition where the body literally locks down speech in certain situations. To outside eyes, the child seems unwilling. To those who know, it's not a choice. It's the body's protective switch. One expert explained it to the court later in simple terms. Selective mutism is an anxiety-based inability to speak in certain settings. The child isn't refusing, her body is locked by fear. We validate non-verbal testimony aids, icons, nods, or simple hand cues so the child can communicate without re-traumatization. It was this guidance that shaped Mia's therapy. Her psychologist introduced hand signals, a curl of the finger for yes, a tap for no, a simple palm open for stop. Each gesture was rehearsed in safe settings with her mother and with Atlas, a therapy K9 later assigned to her case. These weren't tricks, they were lifelines, quiet bridges between silence and voice. At home, the family created what they called safety. Night routines became predictable, same lullaby, same stuffed animal, same prayer, whispered even when Mia couldn't respond. They practiced brave breaths, slow inhales and exhales, guided by her mother's hand on her back. Small picture cards replaced questions. Hungry, sleepy. Play, Mia would point rather than speak. At school, reintegration was careful. A calm corner with pillows and a coloring book waited for her. Teachers were told not to demand answers, only to offer choices. Progress came in centimeters, not miles. But each small step mattered. For investigators, the challenge was clear. A partial plate, a fleeting glimpse, and a child witness unable to speak. In cases of attempted abduction, time is everything. Without usable testimony, patterns risk being missed. This is why they leaned heavily on technology. ALPR hits neighborhood porch cameras, even digital breadcrumbs from nearby cell towers. The fresh perspective here is how modern investigations don't rely on a single eyewitness anymore. A child's silence doesn't close a case, it shifts the focus. Evidence is pulled from everywhere, a plate fragment narrowed through DMV databases, porch cam stills layered into a timeline, phone pings mapping movements. Each data point holds weight, but together they form a net. Still silence at home carried its own weight. Lauren described nights of listening to her daughter's restless breathing, waiting for cries that never came. It's like she dreams in gasps, she told the psychologist. And though words were absent, the signals remained. Mia's finger twitched sometimes at the sight of a gray car passing, sometimes at the sound of a door latch clicking. For her parents, paying attention to those tiny cues became the only way to navigate her world. Communication isn't always spoken. In families facing trauma, progress sometimes looks like a nod, a drawing, a hand reaching for fur. When we measure healing only in words, we miss the quieter milestones. This is where Atlas, the therapy canine, entered the story. A retired service dog, steady in posture, gentle in approach. Mia sat beside him during early therapy sessions, hand buried in his fur. The day she whispered, "Good boy," it was the first sound she had made in weeks. For her parents, those two words carried more hope than any detective's update. Meanwhile, investigators compared notes. The K7R plate sequence matched a vehicle previously cited for illegal feeding in the Smokies. Rangers had documented bait sites, piles of corn left to lure black bears toward roadsides, creating dangerous habituation. The connection was chilling. Someone with a history of baiting forest animals might also be trolling neighborhoods with a similar lure, this time for children. That link shifted the investigation. It was no longer just a case of a man in a gray SUV. It was potentially tied to broader violations of wildlife law. And it made the sanctuary sighting later all the more significant. From Mia's perspective, though, none of those details mattered. What she remembered was the man's face, his hand reaching his words about puppies. She remembered her mother's shout, the screech of tires, the feeling of her voice being swallowed whole. That memory was locked inside her, but not lost. For the family, life narrowed to routines. No playing outside without both parents present. No open gate. No walks to the park. Each adjustment was a reminder that safety had been cracked. Yet within those limits, Lauren kept searching for ways to coax her daughter forward, storytelling with exaggerated voices, drawing animals, showing wildlife videos online. Sometimes Mia would point, sometimes she would turn away. Slowly, the images of forest animals seemed to soothe her, as though the wilderness still offered a sense of order when her neighborhood no longer did. And then came the invitation to the Chestnut Ridge Wildlife Sanctuary. Dr. Pierce had heard of Mia through the therapy network and extended a gentle offer, a quiet viewing session safe behind glass where Mia might find a sense of calm watching Juniper, the black bear cub. No one could have predicted that what started as an attempt to comfort a child would collide with the ongoing investigation. That the cub's instinctive pause would mirror Mia's signal, linking the silence of a child with the awareness of a wild animal. The lesson here is not to over-romanticize it. Animals don't testify in court, but what they can do is trigger human attention, prompting questions we might otherwise miss. A child's silence paired with a cub's reaction turned what might have been dismissed as a coincidence into something worth pursuing. In hindsight, the attempted lure wasn't just an isolated scare. It was the first spark in a chain of events. A neighbor's quick shout, a partial plate, a diagnosis of selective mutism, a therapy dog's patient presence, and eventually a bear cub freezing in place before a crowd. Don't wait for children to snap out of it. Trauma leaves marks that don't vanish with time alone. Tools like nonverbal communication therapy, animals, and consistent safety rituals are bridges. They don't erase the past, but they give children ways to walk forward without having to carry the full weight of words they're not ready to speak. As investigators compiled their files, the sanctuary invitation was penciled into the calendar. It looked like a simple outing for a child, a way to blend therapy with education about forest animals. No one knew it would become a turning point, because while the attempted lure explained Mia's silence, what happened in that sanctuary would soon explain much more. The cub's reaction would lead to warrants, to soil samples, to a cabin hidden in the woods. The man in the gray SUV hadn't disappeared. He had simply stepped into the shadows of the Smokies. And now, thanks to the convergence of silence and instinct, those shadows were about to be lit. When people first heard that a black bear cub had been part of the scene, their first reaction was confusion. Why would a child survivor of attempted abduction be anywhere near a wild animal? The answer wasn't sensational. It was practical, born of necessity and rooted in the Smoky Mountains themselves. Juniper had been found in late spring on a roadside just off Newfound Gap Road. His mother had been struck by a passing vehicle during the night. Rangers discovered the cub at dawn, pacing along the guardrail, crying out with small, sharp whines that carried through the forest. Without intervention, he wouldn't have survived more than a few days. Black bear cubs rely on their mothers for food and protection until at least a year old. Alone, Juniper was vulnerable to starvation predators or wandering into another road. Sanctuary staff transported him to Chestnut Ridge Wildlife Sanctuary, where Dr. Naomi Pierce specialized in short-term rehabilitation. Their goal was always release, not captivity. Contact was minimal, feeding was done behind barriers, and human voices were kept low. The mission was to keep him wild while keeping him alive. But some exceptions were made for education. Carefully designed rooms with thick safety glass allowed the public to see him briefly, not for entertainment, but for awareness. The message was simple: careless human actions, feeding bears, leaving trash, driving too fast. create orphans like Juniper. That was why he was in the room. Not as a pet, not as a therapy animal, but as a living reminder of what happens when wild and human worlds collide. To understand the significance, it helps to know what black bears are and what they are not. They're forest animals, widespread across North America, more curious than combative, generally shy when left alone. Unlike grizzlies, they rarely defend territory with aggression. Unlike polar bears, they don't rely on sea ice to survive. Their lives are bound to the forests, streams, and berry patches of the Smokies. And yet their adaptability often places them near people raiding garbage cans, wandering onto porches, crossing highways. For the Carter family, who lived only a few miles from park boundaries, the presence of bears was ordinary. But the story of Juniper was not. Lauren Carter had hesitated when Dr. Pierce first suggested the sanctuary visit. Why risk it? Her daughter had barely spoken since the attempted lure. Did it make sense to bring her near another reminder of fear, Pierce explained gently. Children who've experienced trauma often find grounding in animals. Not in talking to them, just in being near them. The steadiness of an animal's presence can be a bridge. She wasn't recommending the cub as a therapy partner, but as part of a broader exposure to the rhythms of life still continuing beyond Mia's silence. It was the same reasoning that had introduced Atlas, the therapy K9, into Mia's world. One animal to offer comfort, another to remind her of the wild's resilience. For Mia, the idea resonated in a way no one expected. She had always drawn animal sketches of deer, foxes, forest animals she saw on hikes with her parents. After the incident, her drawings had darkened. Stick figures chased by vans scribbled lines of shadow. But when she was told she might see a bear cub, she picked up her crayons again and drew a small round bear beside a little girl. No words, but the picture said enough. Healing doesn't always come from confrontation with trauma. Sometimes it comes sideways from symbols, from reminders of life beyond the pain. In Mia's case, a cub who had also lost something, a mother, was a mirror she could face without having to speak. Juniper's presence also highlighted a boundary that mattered. Therapy dogs, like Atlas, are trained with certifications, handlers, and protocols that allow them into courtrooms and hospitals. Wildlife cubs like Juniper are not therapy animals. They are wild animals temporarily held destined to return to the forest. Confusing the two would be dangerous. That's why Dr. Pierce and the staff emphasized the distinction during every program. Juniper was not there to perform. He was there to educate behind glass with no contact allowed. This distinction carried weight later in court. Defense attorneys would argue that any animal reaction could prejudice a jury. But in the sanctuary, the cub's reaction was not evidence. It was a spark, a trigger for human investigators to look closer. The cub did not convict anyone, he simply shifted attention. Sometimes the role of animals in human stories is not about proof, but about presence. They don't replace facts. They remind us to notice them. Juniper reminded everyone in that room that day, parents, rangers, staff, that something in the air was wrong. What made the moment unforgettable wasn't just that a black bear cub had frozen in recognition. It was that he and a silent child seemed to act in sync. Mia's finger twitched. Juniper stiffened, and a man in the back row shifted toward the door. That convergence was so specific, so undeniable, that it jolted even the most skeptical observers. It raised the question, coincidence, connection. For investigators, coincidence wasn't enough. They had to follow the procedure to link what the cub might have smelled to physical evidence. And that meant turning away from the glass and toward the data license plates, soil samples, phone logs. Without those, the cub's reaction would remain just a story told in whispers. Yet the emotional impact on Mia couldn't be measured in data. For the first time since the attempted lure, she had acted with intention in a public space. She had used her silent signal not in therapy, not at home, but in front of strangers. That mattered. It told her family she wasn't frozen inside forever. It told investigators she could participate in her own way. It told Juniper, well, whatever it told him, it was enough to still his body and sharpen his gaze. When a child begins to emerge from silence, pay attention to the context. It might not happen in the safety of a therapist's office. It might happen in a sanctuary, or in the presence of a dog, or in the quiet moment before sleep. The environment matters, and sometimes the right environment includes animals, because they meet children where they are wordless, steady, responsive. In the Smokies, Juniper's story was not unique. Every year, cubs are orphaned because a vehicle strikes garbage conflicts or illegal feeding. Sanctuaries do what they can: bottle feed, minimize handling, and prepare cubs for release. But not every cub becomes part of a courtroom drama. Juniper's presence in that room was a product of timing therapy and chance. Still, it's worth reflecting on how his presence shaped perspective. Visitors left not just with photos of a cub, but with questions. How do our choices on the roads and in our trash cans ripple out into the forest? How do wild animals in turn reflect truths about ourselves? In Mia's case, a cub, orphaned by human carelessness, helped her reveal a human threat hiding in plain sight. Months later, when Juniper was larger and ready for release, staff drove him into a remote hollow deep in the park. They opened the transport crate and stepped back. The cub hesitated, sniffing the air, then ambled toward the trees, pausing only once to glance back before disappearing into the undergrowth. His story as an educator was finished. His story as a wild bear had just begun. But his brief time in the sanctuary had already shifted a human investigation. And that's the bridge to what comes next. Because while Juniper returned to the forest, investigators stayed on his trail. Only now it wasn't paw prints they followed. It was a trail of evidence left by the man who had tried to lure a child. Plates, soil, and GPS logs. The cub had sparked attention, but it was the search warrant that would ignite the case. When Juniper, the black bear cub, stiffened at the sanctuary window, it didn't create evidence on its own. Animals don't testify and courts don't rule on instinct. What it did do was spark a question: why did both a child and a cub react at the same instant toward the same man? For investigators, questions become roads, and every court road must be paved with probable cause. Ranger Troy Delgado was the first to step forward when the man in the gray jacket shifted toward the exit. He asked for ID, kept his tone even, and noted the tension in the man's jaw. No arrest, no handcuffs, just enough to establish presence. The sanctuary's security team flagged the footage, saving a timestamp and capturing the SUV in the parking lot. That gave them a thread. Detective Cole Ramirez, lead on the attempted lure case, was called that same afternoon. He already had fragments, a partial plate K&R from a neighbor's sharp eyes, an ALPR hit, placing that plate series near Gatlinburg 2 weeks earlier, and patrol reports of a dark SUV seen circling neighborhoods where children played. Now he had a fresh detail, the same sequence caught on the sanctuary's exterior camera. Probable cause isn't about suspicion, it's about layering facts until a judge sees enough reason to allow the next step. Ramirez knew this. He opened a folder and began stacking pieces the attempted lure. The partial plate, the ALPR, hits the sanctuary sighting. One by one, the fragments formed a pattern. The affidavit he prepared was read aloud in court weeks later, but in his office that night, it was just words typed under dim light: partial plate K&R observed by eyewitness at attempted lure scene. Automatic license plate reader recorded the same sequence entering Gatlinburg at 15:42 hours. Sanctuary footage time-stamped places gray SUV on site during black bear cub education program. Suspect previously cited for baiting forest animals in Smokies National Park. Each line was grounded in a record. Each record is linked to a source neighbor statement, ALPR database, sanctuary, security system, or park citations. The affidavit closed with a request authority to search the vehicle for soil fibers, digital devices, and other trace evidence. The judge, Teresa Nolan, reviewed it carefully. This wasn't a dramatic TV moment, no pounding gavel, no raised voices, just a measured decision, warrant granted. With those words, suspicion shifted into sanctioned investigation. This process, slow, methodical, documented, is what keeps cases from crumbling on appeal. Too often people imagine that instinct alone drives justice. In reality, it is the paper trail, the verified steps that build foundations strong enough to withstand defense challenges later. In high-stakes cases, speed matters, But precision matters more. If investigators leap without grounding evidence, risks suppression. When they move carefully, each piece holds. Probable cause is not about what we feel. It is about what we can show. The cub's reaction was never written as proof. Instead, it became a prompt that turned attention back to the SUV, which was then tied to data that already existed. The animal didn't speak for the case. It simply kept humans from ignoring the clues they already had. Ramirez assembled his team the next morning. The vehicle was found outside a small rental cabin on the edge of town. With the warrant in hand, gloves snapped on bags, open cameras clicked. They collected soil from the wheel wells, fibers from the rear cargo, mat, and digital devices from the dash. Tire impressions were cast in plaster before the weather could erase them. Back at the precinct, technicians logged each item with chain of custody tags. Every signature, every seal mattered. Defense attorneys later scrutinized those forms, line by line, looking for a missed entry or broken seal that could unravel the case. None were found. At the same time, another team reviewed digital records. ALPR confirmed the SUV had been near 3 neighborhoods linked to prior suspicious reports. Cell tower data suggested the driver's phone had been toggled to airplane mode for several hours in the mountains north of Cosby. It was a detail easy to miss, but not for analyst Lisa Chen. She marked it, knowing that a phone going dark in a precise time window often meant someone didn't want to be tracked. This is where the investigation deepened. Soil samples were delivered to the regional forensic lab. A technician later explained the process in clear terms to the jury. Quartz and feldspar crystals under the microscope, pollen grains from tulip poplar and rhododendron, tiny flecks of charcoal consistent with a prescribed burn zone. Together, these markers pointed not to the town, but to a very specific mid-elevation hollow in the Smokies. Suddenly, the trail had direction. The cub's instinct had led to a man. The man's SUV had led to soil, and the soil pointed to a cabin deep in the forest. But before teams moved, Ramirez paused. He knew the weight of the next step. A search without strong probable cause risked everything. That's why he returned to Judge Nolan with a second affidavit. This one layered more soil, and pollen analysis matched specific glacial till zone in the Smoky Mountains. ALPR and tower records placed the vehicle in that zone during a 2-hour window. Tire casts from SUV match impressions near service road adjacent to cabin site. The judge listened, eyes narrowing, then signed again. Warrant approved for premises search. Here's an example of why this matters. In past cases, warrants written too broadly, search any property connected to suspect, have been thrown out. Ramirez avoided that mistake. His request was narrow, the cabin, its basement, and the surrounding grounds. That precision would later protect the evidence on appeal. Meanwhile, Lauren was at home with Mia. She didn't know the details of affidavits or ALPR hits. What she knew was that her daughter had twitched her finger at the sanctuary and clung tighter to her hand at the sight of the man. For her, the investigation's progress meant one thing. Maybe her daughter's silence was not a war, but a guide. In both parenting and law, patience sustains progress. You can't force words from a child, and you can't force evidence into existence. You can only create the conditions where truth has space to appear. And while investigators worked under warrants and lab reports, Mia continued her therapy. Atlas, the canine, sat beside her, head resting on her lap. She drew another picture, a forest, a cabin, and a bear. No words, no explanation. Just images that seemed to echo what investigators were uncovering through science. For the public, the story of a black bear cub freezing in front of a crowd made headlines. But behind the headlines, the careful work of probable cause was unfolding. Layer by layer, the road was being paved not by instinct, but by evidence. That road now led to a cabin hidden in the Smokies. The warrant was signed, the team prepared, and Ramirez knew the next step would either confirm their suspicions or leave them searching again. The mystery deepened. What exactly lay behind that cabin door? The inside of a forensic lab doesn't look like a scene from television. There are no flashing screens or dramatic music, just steady work under fluorescent lights. But sometimes the discoveries that unfold in these rooms shift the weight of an entire case. For Detective Cole Ramirez and his team, those 60 seconds in the soil lab were exactly that. Technician Angela Hayes had handled trace evidence for nearly 20 years. She didn't rush. She labeled, logged, sealed. She placed the sample from the SUV's cargo mat under the microscope. Her voice, calm and precise, narrated the process. Quartz fragments angular. Feldspar present. This isn't generic roadside dirt. She shifted the slide. Pollen grains, tulip, poplar rhododendron. That combination narrows elevation. Mid-mountain coves. She adjusted once more. Micro charcoal flecks consistent with the prescribed burn conducted last season. In less than a minute, she had painted a picture no one could see with the naked eye, not just soil, but a location. She pointed to a map pinned on the wall. This soil is not from town. It comes from the Cosby drainage mid-elevation. That's where your SUV has been. For viewers, this may seem like magic, but it's not. It's science grounded in repeated trials, peer-reviewed studies, and careful comparison to reference samples collected across the park. What makes it powerful is not that it's fast, it's that it holds up under scrutiny. Defense attorneys can cross-examine it, judges can question it, and it still stands. There's a small but vital lesson here. Good forensic evidence doesn't sparkle under black light. It survives in the plain light of a courtroom. The value isn't drama, it's durability. Angela logged her findings, signed the chain of custody sheet, and handed the report to Ramirez. He didn't smile, didn't celebrate. He simply added it to the growing file. Each piece mattered only when stacked with others. The ALPR hits the eyewitness partial plate, the tire casts, and now the soil profile. But the soil wasn't the only trail. Analyst Lisa Chen had been combing through digital records. She called Ramirez over. "Take a look at this." On her screen, a simple timeline showed the suspect's phone activity. At 10:14 a.m., it connected to a tower in Gatlinburg. At 10:17, it switched to airplane mode. For nearly 2 hours, silence. At 12:09, the phone reconnected to a tower north of Cosby. Chen pointed to the overlay. Here's the kicker. The van's aftermarket GPS logged a stop at 11:02. Guess where she zoomed in? A spur road branching off toward an unmarked cabin site. Tire impressions from that road had already been cast. They matched. Soil pollen and GPS aren't flashy, but they tell a story far more reliable than memory. An eyewitness may falter under cross-examination. A child may not be able to speak, but quartz grains don't forget where they came from, and digital logs don't tremble under pressure. The team built a board. On one side, Mia's signal at the sanctuary. Juniper, the black bear cub, freezing the man shifting toward the door. On the other hand, soil pointing to Cosby GPS confirming a stop tire casts matching impressions. The left side was emotion, the right side was evidence. And together they formed a bridge strong enough to cross into court. Ramirez knew the importance of balance. "We can't walk into a hearing saying a cub reacted," he told his team. "We walk in with quartz pollen GPS tire casts. That's what a judge signs off on?" He was right. The cub was a spark, but sparks don't hold in front of a jury. What holds is evidence built to withstand fire. For families following this story, here's a practical takeaway. The justice system moves on careful detail, not spectacle. It can feel slow, even frustrating. But the patience to build a foundation is what prevents cases from collapsing later. Just as in parenting, trauma recovery shortcuts don't work. You build trust brick by brick, just as investigators build probable cause, sample by sample. We compared the soil grains to known samples from the Smokies. The combination of mineral profile pollen and charcoal narrows it to a specific drainage area. The likelihood of a random match is extremely low. She didn't exaggerate, didn't speculate. She just explained clear and simple. And that clarity mattered more than any dramatic reveal. Back in the Carter home, none of this science reached Mia directly. She sat at the table coloring Atlas, the therapy K9, resting under her chair. Her drawings showed cabins, trees, and a little girl with a bear cub. silent signals parallel to the lab's findings. Two worlds moving toward the same truth from different directions. Progress comes from patterns, a child's repeated signals, a cub's repeated reactions, a soil profile repeating the same markers. Patterns noticed and respected guide us forward. The man in the gray SUV had been in a restricted forest zone near a cabin. He had gone dark on his phone during that time. His tires matched the impressions there. His soil matched the ground there. Each point layered until the mystery wasn't whether he had been there, but what he had been doing. The warrant for the cabin was drafted narrow and specific. It included the structure, its basement, and the surrounding grounds. Every word mattered. Broad language could give the defense a foothold. Precision closed the gaps. Soil evidence and digital logs are often challenged as circumstantial. But when combined, they become circumstantial in the strongest sense, circumstances that converge so tightly they leave little room for doubt. That's the kind of web investigators want, not one strand, but many worn together. For the Carters, the science felt distant, almost abstract, but they were told the case was moving, and that was enough to bring a little relief. Lauren noticed that Mia's drawings grew lighter. More animals, fewer shadows. Atlas stayed by her side, a steady presence that reminded everyone that healing was still possible. In the sanctuary, Juniper continued to grow. He no longer fit the image of a tiny cub pressing his nose against glass. He climbed logs, pawed at enrichment puzzles, and built the strength he would need for release. His role in the story was fading, but the spark he had given investigators still glowed. And so the trail moved from lab benches to forest roads. The cabin waited hidden in the Smokies, its doors still closed, its contents still a secret. Investigators knew that once it opened, the story would either collapse or confirm everything they had built. That was the mystery pulling them forward. What would the cabin reveal? Cabins in the Smoky Mountains carry two reputations. To some, they're vacation havens with wood smoke curling from the chimney. To rangers and investigators, they can also be hiding places. This one, tucked deep in the Cosby drainage, looked ordinary from the outside, just weathered boards, a sagging porch, and the wind pushing through rhododendron leaves. What mattered wasn't the appearance, but the paper that allowed entry, a narrowly written search warrant signed by Judge Nolan. Detective Ramirez led the team up the dirt path. No dramatic shouting, no battering ram, just a knock, the announcement of presence, and the slow push of a door already unlatched. Inside, dust stirred. The first impression was emptiness. A table with two chairs, a cot with rumpled sheets, a lantern still warm from recent use. Nothing screamed danger, and yet every investigator knew that absence could be as telling as presence. They began with a method. Photographs first, every angle documented, notes written in sequence. Only after that did gloves touch objects. Ramirez opened a cooler tucked against the wall. Inside were scraps of meat, some wrapped, some spoiled. Samples were taken. Another officer lifted the lid on a plastic bin-bait corn, the kind often used illegally to lure black bears toward roadsides. On the cot beneath a blanket, a child's sticker sheet lay half crumpled. Ramirez paused. He recognized the design. Weeks earlier, Lauren Carter had handed him one identical sheet from Mia's coloring supplies. This was no longer just about baiting animals. This was the trace of a child intersecting with the belongings of a man tied to attempted lures. The basement revealed more. A wooden hatch creaked open to narrow steps descending into cool, damp air. Flashlights cut across the walls. Hooks lined one corner, chains in another. No children were found there, but the implication was enough to chill even seasoned officers. Every item was bagged, tagged, and photographed. A stuffed toy with faded fur was lifted gently into evidence. The team moved deliberately without raising voices or rushing. Discovery without drama. Ramirez reminded them. They weren't there for spectacle. They were there to preserve a record that could withstand a court. Real investigations are built in silence. Not the silence of fear, but the silence of discipline. Television may show chaos, but in reality, officers know every raised voice, every shortcut risks the integrity of evidence. Quiet work is strong work. One example made that clear. At the cabin threshold, a plaster cast was taken of a boot print. The officer nearly stepped on it in haste, but caught himself. By stopping by, working slowly, the print was preserved. Later analysis tied it to boots found in the suspect's SUV. That single pause closed a gap the defense would have otherwise pried open. Outside in the clearing, Ranger Delgado scanned the bait barrels. He muttered to Ramirez, "This isn't just a crime against people. This is a crime against forest animals." He was right. Illegal feeding of black bears doesn't just endanger tourists, it kills bears. Cubs like Juniper become orphans because their mothers, conditioned to human food, wander too close to roads or cabins. The link between human predators and wildlife exploitation was no longer abstract. It was standing in the same clearing. The lines between crimes against people and crimes against wildlife often blur. The same disregard for boundaries. The belief that rules don't apply fuels both. In this cabin, bait barrels and children's belongings sat side by side. Two different victims, both vulnerable, both pulled into danger by someone who ignored limits. As the search concluded, the evidence bags were loaded into vans. Soil from the basement, fibers from the cot, fingerprints lifted from the lantern handle. Each piece was carefully signed over in the chain of custody log. No cheering, no triumph, just steady work. Back in town, the Carters received word of the search. Lauren sat at the table holding Mia's hand. She didn't describe details, the cooler, the toy, the chains. She only said, "They found things, honey. Things that helped the truth come out." Mia looked up, her eyes wide but steady, and pressed her palm flat on the table. It was her silent signal to stop. Lauren understood her daughter needed the conversation to end there. Respecting that signal was part of keeping trust. Protect children not only from danger, but also from the overload of information. In the age of constant news, it's tempting to share too much, too soon. Healing often requires boundaries on what young ears hear. Investigators gathered late that night in the precinct conference room. Photographs from the cabin lined the board. Ramirez pointed to the sticker sheet, the toy, and the bait corn. "These items converge," he said. Child lure patterns, wildlife violations, GPS records, soil, matches. This cabin is our bridge. And yet, even with strong evidence, he knew the next hurdle loomed: the courtroom. Defense attorneys would not roll over. They would argue that contamination, circumstantial links, and prejudice are caused by therapy animals. The prosecution had to be ready. The discovery phase had given them facts. The trial phase would test how well those facts held under cross-examination. That's why every pause at the cabin, every careful signature, every narrow word in the warrant mattered. Without those, all they would have been was stories. With them, they had structure. For the public, cabins often symbolize escape, peace, and a retreat into the woods. For investigators, this cabin became a mirror, showing the darker ways people can twist that isolation. It was not haunted, not cinematic. It was worse ordinary, and that ordinariness made it harder to dismiss. As Juniper the cub continued to grow in the sanctuary, playing with logs and pawing at enrichment puzzles, his story as an orphan paralleled the evidence pulled from the cabin. He was living proof of what happens when boundaries between humans and wild animals are ignored. And now evidence suggested children were being drawn into similar dangers by the same disregard. The chain between cub-child SUV and cabin had tightened. What remained was to test that chain in court. Would it hold under pressure or snap under a defense challenge? That was the mystery, waiting in the next chapter. The courtroom where truth had to pass through the fire of rules and arguments before it could be called justice. The courthouse in Sevier County looked ordinary, from the street brick facade, flag-out front steps worn smooth by decades of trials. Inside, though, tension felt sharper than stone. Families filled the benches. Reporters scribbled in notebooks. At the front, Judge Teresa Nolan adjusted her robe and gave the signal to begin. This wasn't just another case. This was the trial that would decide whether a man tied to attempted child lures and illegal bear baiting would be held accountable. Mia Carter sat at a small table near the front, her mother's arm wrapped gently around her shoulders. Beside her lay Atlas, the therapy canine assigned through the victim support program. He wasn't there to sniff evidence or bark at suspects. He was there for one purpose: to steady a 5-year-old child who had lost her voice. Before testimony began, the defense tried to strike Atlas from the room. Attorney Martin Keene stood, polished tie gleaming. "Your Honor, the presence of a large German Shepherd beside the witness will unfairly bias the jury. It projects fear, it signals guilt, and it undermines my client's presumption of innocence." Judge Nolan listened, eye steady. Then she turned to the jury and spoke clearly. "Members of the jury, the presence of this therapy dog is not evidence. You must not interpret his behavior or his presence as proof of any fact. He is here only to reduce distress for the child witness. Nothing more." Her words were a guardrail, the kind that keeps cases from veering into mistrial territory. Atlas stayed. This was one of many careful boundaries the court drew. Each time emotions threatened to overwhelm, structure stepped in. It's a reminder that justice doesn't reject feeling, but it insists on framing it. The prosecution began by presenting evidence from the cabin. Photos of bait barrels, a cooler with scraps, and a sticker sheet identical to Mia's. Each was introduced with a chain of custody testimony, and each was logged carefully. Technician Angela Hayes took the stand to explain the soil analysis. Her words were calm, almost gentle. Quartz fragments, feldspar, tulip, poplar pollen, rhododendron pollen, micro-charcoal, all matched to the Cosby drainage. This soil did not come from town. It came from that specific forest hollow. She did not raise her voice, did not dramatize, and yet the courtroom leaned forward because the clarity itself was powerful. Next came analyst Lisa Chen with the GPS overlay. She showed the timeline SUV parked near the cabin at 11:02 phone on airplane mode until 12:09 tire casts matching impressions on the spur road. Facts lined up like stones in a wall. Then came the witness testimony. The elderly neighbor who shouted at the SUV driver during the attempted lure described what she saw. Her voice trembled but did not falter. He reached for the girl. I saw it clear as day. Defense attorney Keene rose for cross-examination. "Mrs. Jenkins, you later saw my client's photo in a news article, correct?" "Yes." "And isn't it possible that memory of that article influenced your identification here today?" She hesitated. "I know what I saw," Keene pressed. "Memories fade, images blur. Isn't it possible you're mistaken?" This was the defense's strategy to chip at the edges, to cast doubt. It's a tactic as old as trial itself. Shift attention from hard evidence to human fallibility. But prosecutor Dana Whitaker was ready. She rose calmly. "Mrs. Jenkins, regardless of memory, does the soil report depend on your recollection?" "No." "Does the GPS data?" "No." "Does the tire cast analysis?" "No." "Thank you." She turned back to the jury. Memory is fragile. Evidence is not. The courtroom murmured, then quieted under the judge's gavel. This exchange highlighted the balance witnesses provide the story, but forensic anchors hold the weight. When Mia's turn came, the room stilled. She walked slowly to the stand, Atlas pacing beside her. Judge Nolan reminded the jury again. This child may use signals instead of words. You are not to interpret silence as weakness. You are to evaluate her responses within the framework established by her therapist. Selective mutism is an anxiety-based condition. The child is physically capable of speech, but trauma locks her voice. She communicates through non-verbal signals, nodding hand cues validated as reliable in her therapy plan. With that, Mia was asked the simplest of questions. Was the man who tried to take you present in this room today? Her small hand twitched, curling a finger, then pointed straight toward the defendant. Gasps rustled through the gallery. Atlas remained calm, eyes steady, head on his paws. Judge Nolan raised a hand. Members of the jury, you must evaluate this identification in the context of all evidence presented. She didn't need to add what everyone felt, that the silent signal carried weight, even if it wasn't words. The defense objected. "This is prejudicial. The child has seen my client's image before. Her signal cannot be trusted." But the judge's earlier guardrails held firm. Overruled. The jury will decide credibility. Through it all, Mia's mother kept her gaze steady, ready to comfort without intruding. The bravery wasn't in loud testimony. It was in sitting there at all and raising a finger instead of hiding. Courage doesn't always sound like speeches. Sometimes it looks like showing up, sitting down, and giving the smallest of signals. That too is bravery. Therapy animals, forensic labs, and courtroom guardrails might seem like separate worlds, but together they create a system where a child's voice, spoken or silent, can be heard without being crushed. Atlas steadied Mia. The lab steadied the evidence. The judge steadied the process. 3 stabilizers, each essential. The trial wound toward its climax. The jury had heard the neighbor, the psychologist, and the technicians. They had seen soil slides, GPS maps, and tire casts, and they had watched a child silent but steady, pointing toward the man accused. The defense was cornered. In a quiet sidebar, Keene whispered furiously to his client. The man's jaw tightened. Sweat dotted his forehead. He muttered something no microphone caught. A plea discussion was hinted at, then withdrawn, then hinted at again. Judge Nolan adjourned for the day with a measured tone. "Court will reconvene tomorrow for continuation of testimony." Her gavel echoed, and the room exhaled. Outside, the evening air smelled of rain on asphalt. Families left in clusters, some shaking their heads, others holding children's hands a little tighter. Reporters filed stories about soil and silence, about a cub that froze in a sanctuary, about the blurred line between forest crimes and human ones. For the Carters, it was just another night of carrying both fear and hope. Mia fell asleep beside Atlas, hand resting on his fur, her face calm at last. Lauren whispered a prayer of thanks, not for victory, but for the strength to endure the process. And still the mystery lingered. Would the weight of evidence press the defendant to admit guilt? Or would the case march all the way to a verdict? That answer lay in the final stretch where sentencing and closure waited. The next part of the story wasn't about gathering evidence. It was about what happens when the evidence has already spoken and a family must hear the words they've been waiting for: guilty. The day the defendant stood and changed his plea, the courtroom didn't cheer. No one clapped. Judge Nolan's voice remained steady as she asked the 3 questions required for the record. "Are you pleading freely and because you are in fact guilty?" He nodded, jaw tight. "Do you admit you placed bait in the forest and approached the child on April 12th? Another nod. "Do you understand the evidence, GPS logs, soil-matched tire casts, would likely convince a jury?" His voice cracked. "Yes." 3 words spoken low but heavy enough to end months of silence and fear. For the Carters, the verdict wasn't about winning. It was about breathing again. Lauren held her daughter close in the courthouse lobby, whispering that they were safe now. Mia pressed her cheek against Atlas's fur fingers, curling just slightly, the same quiet signal that had started everything at the wildlife sanctuary. Only this time it wasn't fear she was signaling. It was comfort. What comes after a trial is not always neat. Families carry scars. Children still wake from dreams, hands trembling. Parents live with watchfulness long after the danger has passed. But there are practical steps that ease the road forward, and this case illuminated many of them. One was the therapy protocol arc. The Carters kept nightly rituals, consistent, same story, same stuffed animal, same bedtime prayer. They practiced brave breaths when Mia grew anxious. School staff created a calm corner where she could retreat if the world felt too loud. Healing came in inches, but those inches built a path. For families, watching the lesson is simple. Don't wait for trauma to vanish on its own. Build predictable structures. They don't erase fear, but they make room for courage to return. Another was the role of therapy animals. Atlas wasn't a miracle cure. He was a steady companion. His presence didn't end the case, but it allowed a child to sit in a courtroom without shutting down. This distinction matters. Therapy dogs support people. They don't provide evidence. In contrast, Juniper, the black bear cub, was a wild orphan never meant to fill that role. His reaction sparked attention, but the case was built on science, not instinct. That boundary matters because it protects both justice and animals. Wildlife rangers took their own lessons. The bait barrels outside the cabin showed how human recklessness with forest animals leads to cascading harm. Cubs like Juniper lose their mothers when bears become habituated to human food. The rangers doubled down on public education, lock trash, never feed bears, slow down on mountain roads. Because every time a sow is lost, another cub risks becoming the next orphan. The fresh perspective here is how crimes overlap. The man in the SUV didn't just endanger a child, he endangered wildlife. Both stemmed from the same disregard for limits, the same belief that rules didn't apply. In that sense, protecting children and protecting bears weren't separate fights. They were parallel ones. The community too absorbed lessons. Reporters, who had once clamored for details, now reflected on the danger of leaks. When investigations spread too quickly across headlines, suspects adapt and leads dry up. The sheriff's office hosted sessions explaining Amber Alert mechanics, why some cases trigger immediate alerts, and others rely on quieter bolos. Parents who once assumed safety in small towns began teaching children code words, lock routines, and the idea of tricky people. These were not scare tactics, they were tools of empowerment. The trial also reminded courts of the need for victim-centered design. Judge Nolan had allowed Atlas into the room with a strict limiting instruction. She had reminded the jury repeatedly that the dog's presence was not proof. That small detail guardrail set early ensured the case would withstand appeal. Families watching should remember safeguards exist not to weaken justice, but to make its foundation stronger. For the Carters, progress showed in quiet moments. Mia whispered thank you to Atlas after the verdict. Later, she picked up her crayons and drew something new. A girl holding hands with her mother, a therapy dog at her side, and a bear cub walking into the forest. The picture carried no shadows this time. It was filled with color. And Juniper, months later, he was released back into the Smokies. Sanctuary staff opened the crate, and he paused only briefly before padding toward the trees. His black fur blended with the understory. For a heartbeat, he glanced back, then disappeared into the wild where he belonged. His role in the story had ended, but the reminder he left behind lingered when humans break boundaries. It's the most vulnerable children and cubs alike who pay the price. Justice is not a single event. It is a chain of choices, parents noticing signals, neighbors speaking up, investigators building careful affidavits, technicians explaining soil under microscopes, judges setting limits. Each link mattered. Remove one, and the chain might have snapped. Together, it held. For viewers, the knowledge to carry forward is clear. If your child experiences trauma, trust that healing may come in gestures before words. Use therapy tools, routines, safe spaces. Animals when appropriate. Understand the difference between emotional comfort and legal evidence. Protect forest animals by respecting their distance. Never feed, never lure, always secure waste. Know that justice works best when it balances compassion with procedure. The emotions in this story are undeniable: fear, relief, courage, even awe. But alongside them sits something quieter: responsibility. We all share it. Families, investigators, rangers, neighbors. Each of us is part of the circle that keeps children safe and wildlife wild. The line between our world and the natural world is thinner than we think. A cub, orphaned by a careless driver. A child silenced by fear. An investigator reading quartz under a microscope. These stories are not separate. They meet in the same mountains under the same sky. And so, the call reaches out, not from a gavel, not from a lab, not from a cub's stare, but from a question. What role will you play in protecting the vulnerable where you live? Take a moment to reflect. Are there routines you could strengthen for your family? Are there ways you could keep forest animals safer by locking trash, slowing down on the road, speaking up when you see harm? These choices ripple outward. If this story moved you, if you felt the weight of silence, the steadiness of evidence, the courage of a child, and the instinct of a black bear cub, let it linger. Let it spark not just reflection, but action. And before you leave, support this channel by liking the video and subscribing. That simple signal, small but steady, helps us keep telling stories that matter, stories where justice, healing, and the wild all meet.